is Flora, and welcome to By the Book. It's an interactive webinar brought to you by our co-hosts, cousins Peter, John, and Danny Bookbar. Peter is a CNBC contributor and CIO of Bleakley Advisory Group. John is Vice Chair of Neurosurgery at Lenox Hill Hospital, where he's an investigator at the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research. He also directs the Lab for Brain Tumor Biology and Therapy. Danny, John's twin, is president at Thrasio, the largest acquirer of Amazon third-party private label businesses, and has 20 plus years of experience leading fast-growing consumer businesses for global brands, such as the NFL and Weight Watchers. Peter, Danny, and John are all leaders in their respective fields and will be discussing health, wellness, finance, business, and life with our special guests, Kathy Wylde, Susan Marenoff-Zausner, and Danny Zausner. Feel free to check out our previous episodes on our YouTube channel, which I'll post in the chat. And make sure to watch Netflix's original docuseries, Lenox Hill, starring our very own John Bookbar, if you haven't already. All right, without further ado, take it away, Bookbars.
Thank you, Flora. I'm Peter Bookbar, and just a quick disclaimer before we begin. John and Danny are not affiliated with Private Advisory Group and Bleakley Advisory Group, and nothing they say should be taken as investment advice. And nothing I say should be taken as medical advice. Danny, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. I'm Danny Bookbar. It's great to be here. As Flora, you said, I'm president at Thrasio, former CEO of Circle Line Sightseeing, which is where I met you, Susan, our neighbor and partner in crime at the Intrepid. Also was on the board of NYC & Co., which is where I think I met both you, Susan, and Danny. And was a class of 2010 David Rockefeller Fellow with you, Kathy. So that's where we met. So it's great to have you all with us today. I live on the Upper West Side with a wife of 22 years and 2 teenagers, and really look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Johnny.
I'm John Bookbar. I'm Vice Chair of Neurosurgery. I'm sitting here on the corner of 77th and Lexington at Lenox Hill Hospital, and I'm sort of comfortable where we are in our COVID crisis. As you know, in New York City, we are doing rather well when it comes to our infection rate, our hospitalization rate, and most importantly, our death rates. The number of COVID patients at Lenox Hill Hospital was about 5 this week on average. So we had gotten down to 0 a couple of days ago, but we are still seeing patients. So as many of you know, about 3 million, we crossed the 3 million mark in the United States. And obviously in certain areas like Texas, Florida, and Arizona, we're still in the initial surge. So remember, the term rolling pandemic is a very important term to realize, that just because this pandemic has sort of gone through and rolled through New York, it is now rolling through in its first wave in these other places. And as Peter knows, he's living in New Jersey. The New Jersey governor just mandated mask wearing outside and indoors if social distancing is not possible. So mask wearing is obviously going to be the paramount to stop the transmissibility of this virus. If you're in the subway, you have to wear a mask. If you're inside, you have to wear a mask. We'll talk about this on today's program, but frankly, bars, restaurants, nightclubs, concerts have to stay closed. We know that data came out of Tokyo this week that simply having one nightclub open, and this came out of South Korea in May, can do terrible things with transmissibility. So again, we're in this rolling pandemic that's not quite at the surge in New York, but unfortunately is rolling across the country. Danny?
Thanks, Johnny. And we'll talk about that with Kathy, Susan, and Danny, and how you are all looking at reopening both the city and your respective institutions. So let me do a quick intro of our guest, Kathy Wylde. First, you're president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, the not-for-profit that works with the city's business leaders, government, labor, civic groups. You sit on the board, I believe, still of the NYC EDC and many others, and formerly was a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Fun fact about you, in 2018, City and State magazine considered you the 3rd most important person in New York City and state after Michael Bloomberg and Stephen Ross. And again, I had the pleasure of being part of the David Rockefeller Fellow Program in 2010, and I'm very grateful for that experience. So thank you, Kathy, for joining us. Also joining us today is the dynamic duo of Susan Marenoff-Zausner and Danny Zausner. Thank you guys. Our family is together with your family. We're really happy to have both Susan and Danny with us. Susan, you're president of the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. Again, met you when we were together at Circle Line. And you're the first woman in the 30-year history of the Intrepid, which is super cool. And prior to joining the Intrepid, and I did not know this about you, that you were the GM of women's soccer team, the New York Power. So I didn't realize you were a soccer player, as Johnny and I were in high school too. So that's super cool. And before that, director of marketing at the Women's Tennis Association Tour, the WTA. So I have to ask if that's how at all connected to how you two met. Was it tennis or no?
Well before
No.
that, actually, no.
Well before that. And also you're on the board of NYC & Co. Since 2011. And Danny, welcome. Good to see you again. You're COO of the National Tennis Center. You have 35-year career in sports and entertainment. I didn't know this about you, that you worked at Metropolitan Entertainment, I guess, with John Shearer before this. So that's a fun fact. John Shearer and Metropolitan did concerts on Circle Line when I was there. So that's a good connection. So you were part of the tour management team for the Grateful Dead and many other legendary artists. So before the USTA and National Tennis Center, you had a good music career. So welcome all of you. And Kathy, we're going to start with you again. Today's topics are going to be about the reopening of New York City, and you guys in your leadership positions will play a key role in that. So Kathy, I guess first to talk about the partnership and the role of the partnership, and start with that, since many in our audience may not be familiar with the partnership, and then we could talk about the reopening from there.
So we're an organization that represents business, mostly big business, working in the interests of the city. So we're not a chamber of commerce. We try and be a resource to government and others rather than an adversary. We are obviously dealing with the challenges presented by the COVID, both in the context of being able to reopen the city economy. It's a lot harder to reopen than it was to shut down, I will tell you. So this is not going to be an easy process. And we are dealing with a number of issues there, and we focus on the economy. We also focus on infrastructure, do a lot of work. We have a partnership with the MTA, the transit system, to try and introduce improvements and innovation there. Obviously, they're facing a huge crisis, the MTA, in terms of the lost revenues and the challenges that keeping their capital plan going when they're down $8 billion in revenue. And we're also involved with education, public education in particular, both in the K through 12 and second and college level.
So Kathy, starting with sort of the corporate workforce, and it's an area I know well, being headquartered in New York City. I know last week I saw in Crane's a survey of 10% of corporate workers plan to return this summer, 30% by the end of the year in the office. So what are you telling big organizations, and what do you say about the risk for big companies and why they should stay in New York when they're struggling to get their employees to come back? What's the message? And then what are the incentives that you're advocating for to make sure that these companies stay, that their employees stay?
Well, obviously circumstances have changed since we had our first COVID-19 case on March 1st in New York. And New York was the epicenter of the crisis. We had more disease, more death, more problems than countries around the world, than Italy, whatever. So we were really, our brand was tarnished. It looked like somehow we were sloppy, or we had failed in some way. That's now coming home to roost for everybody who thought they were going to benefit from all the states that thought they were going to somehow get a competitive advantage out of this, because it's become clear that this is not a New York problem. In fact, we've done better than any other state, and thank you to John and all your colleagues in the healthcare professions, as well as many of the other million essential workers who went to work through this whole thing and kept us going. But we are doing well now in terms of containment, nothing to be taken for granted, but we are first among the states in terms of how we have done in terms of containment for the past month and a half, and hopefully that will continue well into the future. So what was your question? Got into
In terms of, what do you, is there
bringing companies
legislation and incentives that you're advocating for to make sure that happens?
We're advocating tracing, testing, health passes, making sure that our buildings are healthy, that people are following protocols, that people are wearing masks, that they keep cleaning the subway day and night and closing it at night to keep it clean if that's necessary. We're advocating to make this the healthiest city in the world, and both short-term and long-term, and making sure that we can safely bring people back to the office. That's really the key. People are not, are looking for when it is safe to commute, when it's safe to come back, and that's what we've got to make happen. So that's the top priority for everybody. And then we're also looking that people want to know they're secure. There's a lot of concern about the current crime wave that's going on, and we're going to have to deal with that and make sure that people feel secure, number two. And then we've got to find out what's going to happen with the kids, and when is school going to open, on what terms? Are people going to be able to go to their job and spend the day, or are they going to have to continue being a teacher at least half time? So there are a lot of those issues that are floating out there. So employers are committed to the city. They are working on doing everything they can to support making the city achieve all the things necessary to bring people back. But they're listening to their workers, their employees. Big companies have almost universally found that they are more productive and have lower costs operating remotely, which has been a shock. And that's going to be, the city's going to have to work hard to change or to counter that dynamic, because it's something nobody knew before, really.
Yep.
Only about 5% of workers had work from home privileges. And now it's been, in many companies, it's been 95% who have been working remotely. The trading floors are at 90% productivity at least. So even the most difficult functions in the financial services industry, media industry, professional services, accountants, et cetera, they've all been working remotely, and they've kept the economy going just fine.
Yeah.
Kathy, can I ask you, I was driving to Lennox-Zausner Hospital for essentially 2 or 3 months during the COVID surge. I'm back to taking the train and the subway. And I just have a couple of observations. One is obviously Metro North, suburban rail is essentially empty. Harlem, the train station on 125th Street seems very different place than it was pre-COVID. It's obviously there's a lot less police presence. There tends obviously a lot more boarded up stores. There's less people. It seems to remind me of sort of New York City in the 80s. It's a little scary for people who are taking the train in from the suburbs. And the subways everyone is wearing masks, which is terrific. But we're at I would say there's about 5 or 10% of capacity on the subways. So how are you going to address that the 6 line subway that tends to get really overcrowded? And how are you going to regulate the capacity of the subway when employers are comfortable sending their people back to work?
Well, again, I think that's what the MTA has said, is ask employers to be flexible, ask them to be staggered work hours, et cetera. So I think that they right now are up to the MTA Port Authority, the PATH trains were carrying about 8.9 million passengers a day. Now it's about 2 million between the buses and the subways and trains. So they're at a relatively small capacity that will build up slowly. It's going to depend on how safe people feel there in the trains. If they see that it's clean, if they see everybody's wearing their mask, and then there may be new technologies. There's a lot of work going on to try and make sure that people have the capacity for contact tracing that'll make a difference, I think, in terms of people's willingness. But it's going to be tough, and the MTA is kind of working every day to figure out how to make sure that people distance themselves. So far, with this current level of population, it's gone pretty well, but it's not an easy task. Obviously, when there's a vaccine and therapeutics to deal with the virus, it's going to be a different question. It'll be a lot easier, but right now it's tough, and nobody knows the answer to that question. I wish they did.
There's some data out of Tokyo, which has an equally busy mass transit system that, 97% of the people who took public transportation in Tokyo were wearing masks in March, April, and May. And the 3% that weren't were Americans and Europeans.
Yeah.
So obviously
Right.
that's a big deterrent of the virus, at least when you're up close on something like the subway. So
No,
that should be obviously an improvement. And I can tell you this morning on the subway, everyone's wearing a mask.
well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Kathy, as you look towards the fall when people start going back indoors, is it, and you look at the state of business, and as Johnny said, a lot of boarded up stores, and every week, every month with low business puts those businesses at risk. When you look to the fall, is it to just power through and try to keep these businesses open so they can survive and focus on as you say, the cleaning and the mask wearing and doing everything you can to make things safe? And if there are flare-ups, you just have to power through just to give these businesses a chance to survive as we go through the fall and into the winter.
It's a very tough question. There are like 240,000 small businesses in New York City alone, to say nothing of the region, and they've gotten some help from the PPP program, the federal loan programs. So maybe about 2/3 of the businesses have received that, but we may well lose 1/3 of the small businesses. Particularly at risk are the neighborhood shopping strips, the small firms, et cetera. It's going to be devastating, and obviously those businesses employ 5, 10, 20 people, and those jobs disappear. Not easy to replace. Interesting statistic, we have 200,000 job openings today in New York City with an 18% unemployment rate. So if you think about that, in January, we had a 4% unemployment rate and we had 300,000 jobs posting. So we've got this huge intensity of a problem where we don't have people whose skills match the jobs available. And that's a challenge that falls on the education, job training, credentialing side. So one way we're going to have to recover, we're not going to be able to save all these small businesses, especially the retail businesses that have been, we've accelerated the brick and mortar retail decline and about 90% of the hotel and restaurant workers are out of work or have been out of work through this pandemic. So these businesses are going to be in real trouble, and we're going to have to figure out other ways, other opportunities to train people for jobs in the growth sectors of the economy, which tend to be technology related. It doesn't take too long to train people for a lot of these credentialed technical jobs in health, but that's got to be a major effort.
Can I just make a comment, Danny, about school reopening? I don't mean to be overly pessimistic, but I don't see any scenario if the current trends continue where universities are going to be able to open. I think what's going to end up happening, and I know, Danny, your daughter is going off to college. I think what's going to end up happening is these universities, and I think the public schools are going to suffer the same thing with influenza coming back after Labor Day and COVID coming back after Labor Day. The health, the student health centers, the nurses in the schools, they're going to be inundated with fever, diarrhea, headache. Every kid is going to be sent out for COVID testing. There's going to be this, one kid gets a positive test, then 12 kids in the class can be quarantined. So unfortunately, I don't see a scenario where school at this moment, and I don't think university is going to be able to pull this off, even with plans like Harvard are detailing, or Cornell, for example. It's going to be very challenging. So now that there's an alternative that we've discussed and lived through with electronic learning and remote learning, I think it's going to be very challenging to open the schools, particularly in New York City and the state. right now as it stands.
No, you're right, and that's a great conundrum because the universities are such a contributor to our role, the growth of technology, our fastest growing sector of the economy, and they attract talent from all over the world. 50% of their graduate students are foreign. The visa order came out this week from the federal government has said those folks who are taking courses online their visas are canceled. They're not able to come and be students. There's another poll that a survey that says that 65% of the students that say if they switch to all online courses, they want a reduction in their tuition.
Yeah.
Well, the college costs are obviously not going to go down commensurately. So there are huge challenges ahead. As I started by saying, it was a lot easier to shut down than to reopen. And that's true for every aspect of our society. And we have never had a crisis before where there was just universally across all sectors, across all geographies, the crisis affected every single sector in some profound way. So this is the most complicated problem any of us have ever had to deal with.
One sector that I think we underestimate is tourism and hospitality. And Danny and Susan, I'd like to turn some of the questions over to you. I think people don't recognize that New York's economic prosperity is driven by in a large part by the 66 million tourists that it gets. And obviously that's taken a huge hit. I think both of you have probably, over the last 120 days dealt with, adversity unlike anything you've ever seen, both having been in your organizations for almost 2 decades. So Danny, I'll start with you. I think the plan is that the US Open will go on, but without fans in attendance. Is that true?
It's absolutely true, Dan. We've been working on 12 different scenarios for the last 4 months. And ironically, when we first started, we said we were going to work the gamut of no fans to only being able to do the event with fans. And early on, everyone said there's no scenario where we want to do the US Open with no fans because that's just not what the event is. It's a New York City spectacle. You were mentioning earlier about tourism. The tourism in New York City represents 400,000 jobs. We hire 7,000 people to work the US Open. We issued 27,000 credentials. This year, with no fans, we're going to have 2,700 credentials. So 1/10 of the working personnel, a lot of which come from all over the world, will be part of the US Open experience this year. So it'll be a completely no fan scenario. We looked at the whole concept of social distancing. You're seeing that in the NFL right now. Mm-hmm. Miami Dolphins are talking about bringing about 14,000 people into the stadium for some of their games. Social distancing at the US Open would be like social distancing in Times Square for the ball drop. It just doesn't work. It's not part of the fabric of what those respective events are. So we're fortunate to at least be able to broadcast to about 200 countries, and we'll rely on our broadcast revenue and a small percentage of our sponsorship revenue to kind of see us through to 2021.
So Danny, over the 2 weeks of the tournament, first of all, the tournament's being played in Queens at the Tennis Center?
Yeah, we're following the regular dates. The only change that we're making this year is we host a series of US Open series events leading up to the US Open. None of those are going to happen with the exception of the Cincinnati event, and that event is being moved to New York City. So we'll become a 4-week event instead of 3 weeks, hosting the Cincinnati event as kind of, I don't want to call it a tune-up because it's real prize money and it's all the same players, both singles and doubles. And then we'll have our traditional 2-week event starting August 31st.
And how do you do the best to sort of quarantine the players during those 2 weeks? Now, obviously you lose, you go home, but for those players that last through those 2 weeks, how do you contain that?
So traditionally with the US Open, you lose, you do go home or you go on to the next tournament, but because we're hosting the Cincinnati event on the front end, you lose and you just keep practicing until the US Open starts. Our quarantine is we're putting all the players in a hotel outside of New York City. Traditionally, they would be in Manhattan and we wouldn't be coordinating their hotel stay. This time we're putting them in a bubble. All the singles player will be in one hotel, all the doubles player will be in another hotel. They don't leave that hotel except to come to the tennis center where we arrange all their transportation back and forth, and then they're here.
For 2 weeks.
For really technically for 4 weeks. They get tested when they first arrive. They don't get their credentials or leave the hotel room until we get those test results back, and then they'll be getting tested periodically. So that's the bubble we created, and that's what we fortunately were able to get approved by New York State in order to be able to get the
so
right.
Federer Djokovic, Nadal are locked in a room for 4 weeks and they're going to sign up for that?
So unfortunately, Federer will not be locked up in a room because he just had knee surgery. So he's going to be somewhere in the Swiss Alps watching on TV.
Okay.
But all the players that want to become a part of the U.S. Open experience this year and potentially win in excess of $3.5 million are going to sign up for that. Yeah.
And the French is having fans, right?
So yeah, unfortunately for New York, or fortunately for Paris, France is in a much better position than we are in the U.S. They announced as recently as yesterday or the day before that they're looking at about 60% of the fans. And right now their event is 2 weeks after ours. Just before our little conversation started this afternoon, China had announced that they're canceling all sporting events for the rest of the world. That's kind of sending all of the schedules for international sports kind of being reevaluated. So we're not really quite sure what's going to happen with the clay court season right after the U.S. Open.
Do you have an opinion? This is whether high school sports should continue. Do you have any idea of whether, there's been talk of moving tennis, for example, from being a spring sport into the fall, maybe with golf, and taking contact sports like football and moving it to the spring. Do you have any comments on whether high schools or colleges should be doing that?
Well, listen, the one thing I could tell you is I'm fortunately able to work in a sport that has the greatest social distancing known to mankind. Yeah. Players are either, in doubles, they're still 20 feet apart from each other usually, or their opponents are 120 feet apart. So I think it makes as much sense as possible where the schedule is allowed to move tennis up to the fall. We were fortunately able to reintroduce tennis at the National Tennis Center for our public programs about 3 weeks ago, and we've got our summer camps operating right now.
Oh, you do?
Which a lot of parents are very thankful for, that we're able to put kids out on courts in a very responsible way, taking temperatures every day and doing everything necessary to keep them safe. But I think it makes a lot of sense as we see the Ivy League schools all canceled yesterday, and a lot more that's going to happen. We all want sports in every which way we possibly can, but it's got to be smart.
Yeah, I would be in favor of moving sports like tennis and golf to the fall and move basketball, football, obviously to the spring if possible.
Danny, I have to squeeze this non-tennis question in. When I heard that you worked with the Grateful Dead and their touring, that my deadhead son reminded me today is the 25th anniversary of the very last Dead show before Jerry died. What was that like?
So I worked for the Grateful Dead from 94 to from 85 to 94, and I did not grow up as a Grateful Dead fan, but I realized quickly from a business sense that they were the sole reason why my paychecks were able to be cashed every week, because they were an incredible entity on the road touring. They were all about touring and not really selling albums. It was an unbelievable experience. By no means was I a groupie, but the experience I got, every aspect of settling a show to promoting a show and finding venues where their fans could go to and kind of have that Grateful Dead experience, was unlike anything else, and probably prepared me for everything else I've been able to do since then.
So did you become a fan on the music afterwards?
I love their music because it was always background music for me, because I was running around like a crazy man for 3 or 4 hours every single night listening in the background. To this day, I never actually sat through an entire show, but I do love their music now, yes. I didn't have an appreciation for it then because I probably was more focused on who the fans were at that time when I was in college, and I really didn't get it. But once I got on the road with them, I fully understood it.
You don't rent out the tennis center for concerts and events? It's exclusively tennis?
No, well, we didn't historically, and it's a long, boring story why, but now that we finished our transformation and all the upgrades we made, this was the first year that we were going to start doing some special events, which all got canceled. So 2021 will hopefully be an opportunity for us to kind of get into that business as well. Congratulations,
by the way. That was just a terrific renovation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one last question before, Susan, we head over to you. In this year where we're talking so openly about social justice and the legacy of Arthur Ashe and Billie Jean King, any thoughts on how the USTA and the values of the USTA and tennis play a role in the discussion that's going on across the country?
Well, listen, I think all sports have a social responsibility to play a leadership role in that subject. And, I fortunately get to work every day at the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center, as you meant. My office is in Arthur Ashe Stadium, and I walk out the door every day to the Althea Gibson statue. three people who were incredibly significant, not just in tennis, but in life, and the social values that they brought to the table are, non-compared. So, we have a role. Every sport has a role. You heard our athletes over time talk about the fact that we're not meant to be role models, but there's no question that the public looks to sports to try to help get us through hard times, and we need to play a role. I saw MLS last night on TV do a great job of trying to, promote what's going on in the world. And we're going to do the same thing you'll see on TV when you watch the US Open this year.
Excited to watch.
Yeah, likewise. So Susan, and so, not last but least, to at least not the least at all, we're so excited to talk to you, but unfortunately it just breaks my heart that the Intrepid's been closed, I guess, since mid-March.
Yeah,
And
since March 13th.
Since March 13th. Tell us, what are the plans, if any, for reopening? Do you know yet?
Yeah, I mean, since the day that we closed, we were working on our strategies to stay connected and then to reopen. And it was very important for us and all of our culturals to try to do that, to try to keep some vibrancy and some supplemental education in the schools as well. But we have formed actually a coalition of museums and institutions around the 5 boroughs to come up with what are some of the minimum requirements based on the guidelines and based on best practices. And every museum's tailoring it differently. But for the Intrepid, the irony is that we have worked for the last decade to try to figure out how to be as engaging as possible, as tactile as possible, as as interactive as possible when you're putting on your AR goggles and your VR goggles and you're listening to our audio guides with a headset and all of those things. And now we're working very hard on unraveling how to make it a touchless experience, but yet still make it as engaging as you possibly can. And then the other quite ironic scenario or situation is that we've also always tried to promote that while we have this incredibly amazing flight deck, that there's so much to do on the inside. And now, of course, we're going back to promoting the fact that we have so much open space, and how great is that? But we are, like many institutions, we are working on all of our social distancing practices and making sure that the transactions in our box office are protected by the plexiglass, and we're mandating masks to be worn. And of course, we have a now timed ticketing policy, and we have everything that you can imagine as far as capacity limits, from our attendants to our bathrooms. And there are spaces that are too tight for right now that'll be closed. And we're starting out with no ancillary kind of benefits or ancillary type of services. So no food and beverage at first, no retail at first, and then slowly as we get used to and we see and judge our roots and our success, we hope, we'll start opening those up slowly. But we're opening up at what will be a maximum for the time being of a 25% capacity.
And when is that?
Right now, we're slated to open up on August 5, as long as all of the phases, we're in phase 4, and as long as the phases continue appropriately, we're looking at August 5, and then
Wow.
If we have to move it, we'll move it.
Kathy, is that the same you're hearing from the other culturals?
Yes, Susan didn't get into, they've all gone through a huge transformation and tried to sustain some customer relationship and have figured out, and they'll all be opening as part of phase 4 slowly. But the revenue losses are just tremendous for most of them. I think philanthropy has been pretty strong in supporting most of the institutions, but the revenue and fee and income from concessions and other things, those losses are just overwhelming. And as a cultural, you kind of go from year to year. I'm sure it's hard to make those up, Susan.
No, you're 100% spot on. Look, international visitors alone make up 55% of our gate, and our gate makes up a huge amount of our total operational budget. And so it's a hit all around. Being closed completely has been very tough. And of course, we're trying to manage that and have received PPP funding, but that doesn't cut into what the losses are to begin with.
Susan, I know you're in, you're going to be in phase 4, you said August 5th, correct? And
we're hopefully phase 4 will be before that. We have decided to open up August 5.
August 5. And other states like Independence Hall in Philadelphia or national parks, everyone is on their own schedule, correct?
The other states are on their own schedules, correct.
And have other states with similar museums or models been successful in this, and you've adopted their strategies, or are you sort of leading the way?
Without a doubt, we looked first of all at Europe, who opened up before us, and we saw that many European institutions, very famous museum science centers, were opening up at 15 to 20% capacity, and how they were managing their worlds on their own. And then coming here, we have, for instance, we're part of ASTEC, which is the Association of Science and Technology Centers, and there are centers that are opening up around the country. And I'd say for the most part, we're all experiencing the same things, and we're all looking at those very similar practices. And so there's not anything that's really crazy new here, but we're following the guidelines of our governor, and we're trying to do even more than that. All of us have developed now apps that are on your phone that are on any devices, so you don't have to put on any kind of common headsets. We're all looking at closures of certain areas to start with so that we can manage the flow. So all very similar in that respect.
Now, Susan, to manage the 25% capacity, whereas pre-COVID, it seems like you can just show up, buy a ticket, and get on the ship. Do you have to sort of make a reservation now so you can control the 25%?
That's exactly right. We're doing timed ticketing. And so again, that's a different world for a lot of us, but it is absolutely critical for us to be able to manage that, yes.
And literally the submarine, the space shuttle, those are pretty tight spaces. Can you actually go in there anymore?
So the Space Shuttle Pavilion you'll be able to go into, yes. And we have now a one direction in, one direction up on our platform, one direction out. And so we've done that in any of the spaces that are tight. For instance, our entrances, it's one way in, one way out, as opposed to being able to share those entrances. For the time being, our growler will be closed. And we want to be able, we have everything ready to go for it, but we really needed to see behaviors. We want to take surveys afterwards. We really want to see results of the types of things that we're doing before we move forward on other kinds of spaces.
Are you doing temperature checks on the way in?
So it's so interesting you asked that question. It is probably one of the biggest dialogues and longest dialogues that we've had as a coalition together. We are not requiring temperature checks on the way in, and I'll tell you why. There are several different reasons, and you being in the medical profession, we've been listening to a lot of and speaking to a lot of infectious disease doctors about this. But as far as
before you tell me your answer, I'm just going to tell you I think it's a waste of time. So you tell me your thoughts.
So we're treating, well, there's the two compartments, right? There's the visitors and then there's our staff. So we're requiring our staff to do your typical questions, a Q&A on an app when they're home. So if they answer all the questions, have you been around someone for 14 days? Do you have a temperature, this and that? And they answer all that they're clear, a green, yes, or go, or check will show up on their phone. They'll show that to security when they walk in. As far as temperature checks for visitors, we are going to be behaving as though everybody has COVID. That is how we are managing our institution. So we are making sure you must wear a mask. If there's an accessibility issue, then we will say, yes, you can wear a shield. We've been told they're not 100% as great as masks, but we're told they're good enough for what is the transactional type of interaction they may have with somebody else. We are making sure that there's hand sanitizing stations every some odd feet in the institution, and particularly if anything is a touch space. We're doing the extra sanitizing and extra cleaning. So we're treating the institution as though anybody or everybody has it, and that's how we'll behave. As far as, again, the staff is much more manageable. If they answer the question, then they're clear to go. And if they have a fever, we don't want them coming here for us to even see that they have a fever. We want them to protect themselves and protect others by staying home.
Do you have time for me to ask them a question?
Of course.
I'm curious for both of you, how does the, how important is liability protection, liability caps to both of your institutions that the federal government is now considering?
For us, it's very important. I mean, anybody can claim anything at any time. And so it's definitely an issue that we have to contend with, without a doubt.
Yeah, it's certainly the same for us as well. I mean, obviously this year, while we're not dealing with the general public, it's just our own employees and the players that we're primarily dealing with and our broadcast partners, but it's still the same issue.
It's enough for a class action.
Exactly.
No, it's people don't realize how important this is to nonprofits as well as to employers, to government agencies, the whole the exposure of the costs you've already incurred, and then to be subject to class action suits. Again, if you're doing everything right with the protocols that they're following, you're doing everything you can possibly do. you've still got that exposure, which is another reason that's holding back reopening of the economy.
Without a doubt. There's an exposure to the de-escalation process. What happens if you try to de-escalate and then that becomes an issue? So there are several layers to it, and it's a risk. It is.
Susan,
What do you mean de-escalation in that sentence, Susan?
Well, I think that we've already heard stories and seen if somebody's not wearing a mask, for instance, or they're not following protocols, and you're asking them, please separate yourself by 6 feet, please put on a mask. And they're adamant that I can't wear a mask. Well, please put on a shield, and I don't need to put on a shield. That's a challenge, and there has to be de-escalation training that we're all going through, actually, but there has to be some kind of process so that it doesn't interfere with other visitors, other staff. And then that becomes a risk as well as far as liability.
Early on in April, when we were talking about this, when stores were talking about starting to reopen, and they were all worried, and they were all saying, well, we'll call the police, and the police will have to take responsibility for helping to maintain the lines at the curbside for purchase, etc. And obviously it's become much more difficult for the police to get involved in this kind of altercation. So it's these challenges are building on themselves, and we shouldn't end on a negative note, but the complexity, I think New York is going to do better with the complexity than most places, because we're used to dealing in a heavily interactive, complex environment. So I'm positive in that sense, but no one should underestimate it.
Susan, I have a non-COVID related question. So one of the beauties of a museums is that it keeps memories alive. And having the Intrepid, this massive ship and what it represents from World War II, how do you reach these younger generations where a lot of the veterans are unfortunately passing away every day, and there aren't live people to tell their experiences at some point? And how do you make this special for our kids and our kids' kids?
So that is something that since the day I got there, we were working on. What are the future generations going to think? And when World War II becomes almost what the Spanish-American War became in our history books, a page, what happens then when they're not even learning about the history? But there are a couple of different things that we've always focused on. And now this is also kind of that new, I know we all probably don't enjoy this phrase anymore, but that new normal that we have to figure out. But all things digital. So if we can take our information and we can transform it into augmented reality and virtual reality, and that's what I was talking about, that is tough now because it's putting on the goggles and putting on the headsets, and how do we do this? We're figuring out how to do it on your individual devices. We take what is something that might look stale and staid to these generations, and all of a sudden we make it something that's really interactive and really engaging, and it is just in their language. And so we're trying to do many of those types or styles of technology. But the other thing that we're looking at, or not looking at, that we started doing a while ago is we're working on how do we become an Instagram moment. I remember when the Vessel opened up, and when Vessel opened up, everybody was doing an Instagram moment of putting their phone down on that blue light and taking a selfie. Well, what are Instagrammable moments around the ship? And so those are the types of things that we keep looking at to say, let's capture their attention. Once we capture someone's attention, we have found ourselves to be pretty successful, but it's about capturing that younger generation's attention.
Fleet Week is always such a great week in the city, and the Intrepid, you play such a role in Fleet Week. This year it was when what was the name of the Coast Guard ship that came in with the extra beds? That was our version of Fleet Week this year. I suspect, Susan, everything else was canceled, and this year we got the Coast Guard vessel as our only Fleet Week, right?
USS.
That must have been
USS.
that must have been heartbreaking.
It was very heartbreaking, but I will say we also had a very bittersweet lemonade out of lemons solution, in the sense that we did put together a virtual ceremony and virtual components to it. And so we had the Navy Band as part of our virtual program, and the governor actually did his press conference that day, one of the days on the ship during Fleet Week, on Memorial Day actually. And we were able to have a wreath ceremony honoring those that are serving us in two ways. We actually had an Army personnel who also served on the front lines in COVID as a surgeon. And so it was able to combine both what was service and service, really. And so it was pretty special. We put together a lovely program in order to honor, commemorate, celebrate.
That's so nice. One final question, and then we'll wrap it up. The question for Susan and Danny: the role of NYC & Co. and the coalition. How are they supporting both your organizations and reopening?
You want me to take it? Go ahead.
Go ahead, and then I'll jump in after.
They, first of all, NYC & Co. Had gone through the same pain, I think, that all of us have gone through, in the sense that they've had to streamline their team, furlough their team, and everybody who remains active is doing double, triple, quadruple time, I think, like all of us. And they have been incredibly creative, making a 180, forming this coalition, having a 180 in the sense of, here we were, your international magnet. We were out there trying to get everybody to come into New York, and realizing at the moment that is not feasible. This All in New York City, All in NYC campaign that they've just launched, I don't know if you saw the press release today, is really about bringing New Yorkers back together to say, you know what, instead of waiting for your cousins from California to come in to go to the Empire State Building, why don't you go to the Empire State Building? And I mean, I'm totally that person too, where I haven't visited some of our culturals because you wait until your friends and family come in. So that NYC messaging is really part of their roadmap, as well as their Stay Well NYC pledge, which is showing slowly but surely the region and the country, and then ultimately what will be internationals, that we are safe, that we're following guidelines, and that we're a city that is great to visit. So they're just, they've really turned on a dime to promote us and New York.
All right, the driving market suddenly is where you'll market to, is the 100-mile radius around the city instead of the internationals. Danny, any final thoughts on that?
I would just say, ironically, with NYC & Company, there was a lot of rumors going out there in March and April about the U.S. Open possibly moving to California. And Fred Dixon, who's the king of tourism for New York City, called me up in a panic saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "We're not going anywhere. It's either in New York or it's nowhere else." And then he was like, "As long as I have you on the phone, can I ask you to be a part of our coalition?" Which I was delighted to do. And I've been a part of 4 or 5 meetings so far, and it was all part of this launch of what Susan's talking about with All In. And, first thing is they realize no one's going to be traveling internationally to New York City right now. So it's all about trying to get people from the tri-state area to reconnect with New York. And then they also understand that we have to still promote New York City as the postcard to the world and get people excited to travel again. And I think the campaign is phenomenal, and it's going to do that. They have to certainly restore confidence in meeting and event organizers. And so it's all part of this 5-point plan they've got. And I think it's what they've been able to get accomplished in the last 45 to 60 days is really phenomenal. And as I mentioned before, it's really all about getting the 400,000 tourism and hospitality workers back to work as soon as possible.
Yeah. Kathy, any final thoughts?
Well, I think we've all got to be positive. We've got so much talent in New York. I'm worried about the actors. I'm going to have a call with the Actors Fund next week because their side job was as restaurant workers.
Right.
And so they were, it's sort of a double whammy. And that's a talent, and it's unlikely that Broadway's now saying they're going to open first quarter next year, but that's a long time to be out of work.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll tackle that topic next week.
Well, that's a good idea.
Yeah. We'll get Charlie Flateman and some others to join us. Well, thank you, Kathy, Susan, Danny, so much for joining us and talking about your positive views about the opening of New York City. Peter lives in New Jersey, Johnny lives in Westchester, I live in the city. We need to all take our families to all the culturals. That's our assignment at the end of this show. And everybody who's listening needs to buy their tickets to go to see the Intrepid and the other culturals and do their part. So thank you guys for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody on By the Book next week. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, everyone.
Thanks so
Nice
much.
to meet
Bye,
all the
everybody.
folks.
Yeah.
Everyone, bye.